But it is the case still that I think in news in particular, it's a problem if a parent needs to be out of the office, take time off. And I think it's got something to do with the very nature of the job, which is sometimes things need to be done immediately.
Hello and welcome to the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast. This is the show where I speak with the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by the fantastic Katherine Griffiths. Katherine is city editor at Bloomberg within the business arena. She was previously banking editor of The Times and has wrote a number of fantastic articles, the most recent around the London Stock Exchange Group event, 50 years since women trailblazers joined the London Stock Exchange. Welcome to the show, Katherine.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And the last time I got to see you, Katherine, was fabulously in person. You did an expert job chairing what was a brilliant panel talking about 50 years since women were in the stock exchange. And what would be really fantastic, because I know how passionate you are about gender, amongst many other areas of diversity, is if you could give our listeners a little whistle-stop tour as to how you climbed that ladder and got to be where you are today.
Yes. So I've worked in the media, in newspapers mainly for over 20 years. I worked at various big British national newspapers. I mainly started at the Independent, and that included I went to New York for a little bit of time when life was exciting, and I felt like I could sort of conquer anything. I then worked at the Telegraph during the financial crisis, which was probably a career highlight. It was just the biggest story of the time. It was absorbing, it was exhausting, but it was incredible. And then I worked at the Times for 13 years. And during that period of time, I had 2 children. And on the one hand, I had quite a lot of experience as a journalist by then, but then kind of things really changed, having to also have that not inconsiderable job at home of looking after kids as well. And you get used to it, but it's not that easy. And then I've been here at Bloomberg for just over a year.
Fantastic. Oh, goodness me. I bet the stories and the things that you've seen have just been off the Richter scale. And talk to us a little bit about the children and the steps within the journey. Because, of course, I know people who are listening to this may be thinking, hey, we're talking here around the gender agenda again, but it is something that is so key. And I think there is almost, I think we forget how far legally as well we have come in the gender journey and the challenges, but also the beauty of having children, becoming a parent, or even having, say, caring responsibilities as well at times. But talk to us about that time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel very aware that my experience, of course, is shared by a lot of people, but by no means by every woman. Some women, of course, don't have children. Perhaps they're not at that stage. Perhaps they don't want to have children. Perhaps they can't have children. So I'm very aware that in sort of presenting this issue as a kind of a huge, almost universal challenge, and of course, gift, I think some people may feel, well, it's not one for me for a range of reasons, and I think one has to be very respectful and understanding about that. But I can only talk about my own experience when it comes to my own career. And so, yes, I think, and I guess everyone must feel this to an extent, but I really do feel we have lived through quite a big period of change in terms of gender and the workforce and other areas of diversity in the workforce. And that relates to childcare too. So I remember when I was at the Indie, I was in my 20s, my early 20s, and I remember it being this really weird alien thing, this notion of other people having to kind of go home to look after their kids, or if a kid was ill, this problem that was created. And I had no interest in that, quite honestly. But now when I think back, I sort of think of all the challenges that those people had. Um, of course, it was a far less digitalized workplace as well. And, basically you had to be in the office, sitting at your desk if you were seen to be doing your job. And overwhelmingly, of course, that fell to the women on the team, and they were few and far between. And I really remember very distinctly one of my colleagues who was in fact a man. His wife, I think she was an academic. They as a couple were of the view that it needed to be shared parenting. But it was a problem for my colleague who was the husband in this partnership, because if he would go to our boss at the time and say, my child's unwell, it was absolutely the case that it was a very, very unwelcome piece of information, and it was generally seen as not okay for this particular person to try to work from home, or frankly just not work for a few hours or even a day because their kid was sick. So, this is a very kind of prosaic issue. Not, I'm not telling anyone anything people don't know. I completely understand. But I think we have moved on. But I suppose what I slightly feel, and maybe isn't a very upbeat message in many ways, is actually not here at Bloomberg, because it's got a real kind of culture that is quite different from other places. But it is the case still that I think in news in particular, it's a problem if a parent needs to be out of the office, take time off. And I think it's got something to do with the very nature of the job, which is sometimes things need to be done immediately. Some news happens, it's got to be done right then. And actually, it's really, really hard to sort of know how you cope with that when you think about the other stresses and strains of life. But what I would say, I suppose, is, okay, so what do you want to do? Are you really going to say that all the parents on your workforce, and primarily women, because it is still seen as the mother's responsibility, whether or not that should be the case? Of course it shouldn't be the case, it should be shared. You have to find some way of dealing with that, because the best answer is not, no, sorry, you can't have that flexibility. There has to be a better way. And I try to kind of demarcate Bloomberg a bit there, because actually, partly because it's a big newsroom, there's a lot of resource. Really, quite genuinely, there is a sort of a feeling here that it's taken seriously as an issue. And I think British newspapers are under strain. They're increasingly lacking in journalists. They're under financial strain. But it is absolutely incumbent on management in those institutions to take this issue seriously and find a suitable way forward.
I couldn't agree more. And to your point, it absolutely is still a prosaic issue. And yes, we have moved on, but there's a huge amount of nuances within the different industry sectors. To your point, media has come a long way, but it is such a reactive industry that it has and will always take with it a lot of those cultural aspects that then need to be dealt with appropriately if we are to fully come into the digital modern age, in particular for future generations of leaders and people coming into the workplace. And we also think, and you alluded to it yourself, is that it still is, generally speaking, deemed as a female and a kind of a maternal, motherly, female issue to deal with. And so going back, what is a pretty short period of time, a decade, 2 decades, where it was deemed as unacceptable, we have to an extent come a long way, and we're only heading in that one direction. We're never going to go back from being digital and online, and so there is no other way for employers and organizations to go ultimately.
No, absolutely. And I don't know whether you'd agree, but I do feel the key, as we discussed actually at the stock exchange panel the other day, I feel the key, it's not a silver bullet, but it's near to being a silver bullet, is shared parental leave. If it starts with it being seen as an absolutely shared endeavour, that it's the mother, it's either one of the parents who takes time off when the baby is born, and indeed maybe it's a shared period of time. I think if that becomes completely mainstream, and I don't think it is yet by any means, and of course that leads us on to a discussion about pay in many ways, but if that is a shared thing, then I think from there flows the notion that actually, yes, it could be either one of the parents who might need to drop things because they need to go and get their child because their child's not well, or they can't work that particular day, or they work from home and they do their best, kind of thing. So yeah, I really, really do think, and my kids were born in 2011 and 2014, and so really before it was properly embedded and accepted that both parents could take shared parental leave. Certainly my husband would say now, absolutely, I would have done it if it had been the thing to do, but I'm not sure. I think he would have done if really across the board both parents were doing it. But it's, just to be completely honest about it and frank, he would have felt it would have been not just kind of bad for his career, because it was certainly bad for my career in many ways, but also just a bit embarrassing as the dad, going around with the small baby on some sort of leave. And I think, of course that's changing, and genuinely, sincerely hope to see much more change in that area.
Again, I'm nodding furiously as you're speaking, and I love honest and frank. Absolutely love honest and frank. And I'm thinking to myself here, I'm hoping that there's no one from my husband's work listening. However, he had 2 weeks off, and like you said right at the beginning of the podcast, we can only speak to a certain extent to our own experiences. And of course, there are people who are single parents and same-sex partnerships and all of the different beautiful aspects of what parenthood looks like. But of course, for you and I and for others, it is different. But my story relates very similarly to yours, in that my husband has a job in a big corporate. It is within the automotive industry, and so there is, because of these industry nuances we talk about, there is that, whether it's the embarrassing factor or whether it's also the cultural factor as well. And these aren't things that are necessarily, there's process, there's policy, there's procedure, yada, yada. These are changing, and that's fantastic. But the big piece is that cultural piece that you mentioned. And I remember having a bit of a heated debate two weeks after having given birth to our first son, who's now 11 months old. We had him through IVF, and we feel so lucky and so grateful for that. But I remember really being highly emotional and, saying I just couldn't believe that he was going back after 2 weeks. And a part of it was that he's worried about what people will think, and also promotion opportunities. At the time, there was a number of things happening, lots of change, lots of transformation within the organization. And so it then naturally falls back to you. And you kind of, I'm not saying I don't understand. I mean, at the time, the 2 week old baby and myself were very, very black and white about it all. However, I guess looking back, I do understand that there is pressure. There is pressure from peers. There is the, how you explained it there. How does that feel then for them in that environment? And that's an environment that has been that way for many, many years. Doesn't change overnight.
No, exactly. And yes, in when I was just talking, that's why I slightly switched from talking about mothers and fathers to parents, because as you say, families can look all sorts of different ways. But yeah, similarly, my husband works in the media too, and um, newsrooms in general are have been, in my experience at least, pretty old-fashioned places, and genuinely not the case actually here now at Bloomberg. But the culture of British newspapers, things are changing, but looking back into the past, not really that far, we're talking about a not very diverse group of people in terms of course, men and women, in terms of ethnicity, crucially, in terms of class and education. It's incredibly small strata of people who are the decision makers at British newspapers, or have been for a long time. And again, speaking from my own experience, these may well be people who men who have families, have children, but overwhelmingly, those children will have been looked after by the mothers, by the wives, maybe by a fair sprinkling of nannies. But it has not been people's experience who have been in those senior roles that they are the ones who've been phoned up by school to say, I'm really sorry, but your son has just, vomited everywhere and you've got to come and get them right now. And I think to have that change, and to see people in senior roles, women, let's go out there on a limb and say women, mothers who have had that kind of thing happen, and know that it's not the end of the world actually, therefore, if there needs to be some flexibility, is a really, really good thing. I suppose I sort of end this blurb that I'm saying right now by just, I suppose, though, coming back to this, the crunches that I think you have to think about, which is in the world of news, the fact that sometimes things have to be done immediately. And so how do you deal with that? And I think to a friend of mine who is a management consultant, and she has 3 children, and she went for partner and she didn't quite make it. And one of the issues was because she couldn't do as much international travel. She had 3 really, really small children. She didn't want to do as much international travel. And that was a problem for her firm. And I think you've got to be honest about these things. I guess, yeah, that probably was a problem for her firm. But what's the answer? Is the answer, don't make this person a partner? She'd worked there for quite a long time. She was seen to be really fantastic. Don't make her a partner. Or is the answer, do make this person a partner, invest in them, give them a boost, and just have a bit of flexibility, because actually in a few years' time, she may well want to do the international travel again. And if she doesn't, it's probably not the end of the world. There's probably another solution. And I really feel it's important to acknowledge the difficulties and kind of go from there, rather than to say, no, absolutely everyone, whether you've got children or you haven't got children, can operate in the same way. Or it may not be children, it may be other challenges, lots and lots of challenges out there in people's lives, not least elderly parents or other dependents. But I think it's just really important to acknowledge those points and go from there.
Absolutely. It's supporting and acknowledging those life stages that we all are going through in many different ways. And as you were talking about your friend who is the partner within his management consultancy, it makes my blood boil a bit, because it's the solution focus that is needed. And if we keep ending up in these situations where, okay, fine, there is obviously a need for the business, there's a need for the clients. However, what does that then mean? It means, well, we're never obviously then going to have any female partners, those with children, ever reaching the lofty heights that we need them to. Otherwise, we don't get the role models, we don't get the real models, as we like to call them at Dial, we never get anywhere. And so whilst I often have people saying to me, oh goodness, diversity fatigue, this is a conversation that just seems to go on and on and on. I'm like, well, really, culture is living and breathing and sleeping. It's the same as diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity, culture, and so on and so forth. You don't say, hang on a minute, we're not working on the culture here. We have to keep reinvesting in employee development, but also in talent within the organization. You know, let's look at the outcomes for a moment with your friend who's a management consultant. You know, she then feels upset, undervalued, has been there for many years, so has already contributed a significant amount. She hasn't just come into the organization and expected a number of things. She's been there, she's proved her service, she's well thought of. And so then to hit that as a ceiling, you know, motivation levels will go down in a time where, you know, people talked a lot about, you know, kind of talent retention, but really talent retention then being linked to that knowledge and that human capital and, you know, profitability, of course, for the respective organizations. I mean, it just seems complete madness that then wasn't a consideration. But, you know, again, I think, you know, we both said here, you know, we get that there are, you know, of course, there are business needs, and of course, there are imperatives to how organizations have had a certain culture. Knowing management consultancy, and I'm former exec search, there is that it's a very reactive culture. It's a very, you know, it's almost, it's known for being quite up and out, up or out, should I say. But it doesn't mean that there's a full stop at that, really.
No, yeah, because really that's right. I think because if you take a different view, and I suppose, you know, looking back into recent history, yeah, you're just slicing the group of people who can do these more senior roles to this, you know, it's sort of people with who never need to kind of have out of work commitments, who don't have any other things going on in their life, and or at least who manage to outsource all those other things. And, you know, just by its very nature, it's going to just therefore really, really narrow down your talent pool. And you may well have some incredibly great, clever people in that talent pool, but they're just not going to be very diverse. And I always think there's a huge irony with this in the world of the media, because our very job is to be outward facing and looking at the whole world and reporting and writing about all walks of life and all sorts of different situations. And yet, at least until quite recently, you know, the people busying themselves on their typewriters are, you know, at some places, you know, white men, Oxbridge educated, probably grew up in the Southeast. It's sort of quite funny in a way. And not to say those people can't write a diverse range of stories and can't understand the world, because of course they can do. But I just think there's a particular irony in the fact that here you are trying to sort of give insight into these different things without really sort of living it in your own newsroom. And certainly I saw before joining Bloomberg at other places some change coming through in terms of graduate trainee schemes or just trainee schemes, and, you know, some really, really big moves to try and bring in young people from very different backgrounds. And so it's a great concrete change. And I guess let's see. The key to that success, though, of course, will be will those young graduate trainees go through? Will that be their career, whether it's at that newspaper or somewhere else? And if they don't, why not? And hopefully they will. And no doubt the answer will be some will, some won't. But yeah, I really hope a lot do, because it will really properly bring about change.
Indeed. It's about, put quite simply, the closing of the opportunity gap. As you say, we've got to put our money where our mouths are, and we've got to put some of these big interventions in to ensure that we're feeding the talent pipeline, but also that we're doing that at each of those levels. We've seen big sways of moves with organizations, which I think is superb, like those that you've mentioned with, whether they be grad schemes, whether they be schemes to look at underprivileged areas to bring in great talent, because does it matter where the talent comes from if it's great talent? No, of course not. And so these are fantastic. They also see still, and it was one of the reasons why I got into what I do, is I realized the higher up the classical corporate hierarchy you go, the lower and the lower the diversity was. And it was really quite a naive thing at the time. I thought, hang on a minute, I'm it was in exec search, not anymore, of course, but at the time was like, hey, I'm getting higher up in these roles, CEO -2. There's barely any women. There's barely any visible people of color, or those talking very proactively about parenthood, caring responsibilities, or even fertility, which is something now it's very pleasing to see that. But as you mentioned, it's a strange kind of juxtaposition, irony piece, because surely we want representation for the wider world, and we want better economic growth and prosperity, and it's the commercial lever of that as well that drives our businesses.
Yeah, and I guess it strikes me that to this point about crunch, I think again there's been some tremendously smart young people who've come into previous newspapers in these recent years, but they're not I mean, no, obviously no young people are the finished product, of course not, they've got to learn their trade. But I think it is the case that you might get some kids who might have had an education where they come out very polished, maybe their own family upbringing and their education, they come out very polished. They're not, they're not absolutely ready to go completely as fully fledged reporters, but they're probably a bit closer than you might get some kids who maybe have they're not quite as ready. And I suppose in that sense, that's where the crunch is. You've got to appreciate where the talent is. And then I suppose if you look at it in a different situation further on, and like you were saying about chief exec -2 levels or whatever, and again coming back to this point about women coming back from having kids, there's a crunch, because in my own case, I took 2 years of, I took almost a year after both children, which in many ways I now think, what on earth was I doing? Of course that was going to be like, absolute death knell for my career. It wasn't a death knell, but it was in certain naivety on my part, I think, that I thought, yeah, I'm going to take this time and come back and it's all going to be tickety-boo. But it's not a new idea. We know the fact that women therefore have less experience because they're taking that time out. And so, how do you make sure that women were doing extremely well before those children can still come back and, progress up to those senior levels? Because they probably want to. That's why they're coming back. It's really, really hard to do a job and have young children. They want to do the job. So can you give them just a little bit of help to over that crunch period of time to kind of make sure they don't think, actually, do you know what, this is too difficult, I'm not doing it, or I'm going part-time, or whatever it might be?
I really like how you're describing this as the crunch period, and I can see also how you would fear that this might impact a career. One of my final questions, actually, which I think is super interesting, because I know there'll be a number of people listening to this thinking, well, I would love to be where Katherine is today. She's done it. She's had 2 kids and she's taken that year out and done it in a time also where progressively over those, over the last decade and such, we've seen a shift. Yes, but how did you do it? And what would be your advice for others who are listening to this or watching this with captions and thinking, I want to do that. I want to do that. How do I do it, Katherine?
So I think it's an incredibly difficult question for me, at least, because, if I'm honest, when I look back, my children are 11 and 9 now. When I look back, say 5 years or so, it was just really, really hard. I think, they get ill all the time. You get ill all the time because you're so unbelievably exhausted. I don't have a particularly uplifting message, if I'm completely honest. I do think that sense of sharing with your partner, and actually having kind of slightly panned my husband on the maternity paternity point, not that it really existed then. Certainly over many years now, we do have an equal sharing, and I suppose I think that's the key point. But I think it's difficult because, of course, the two parents may have very different jobs. Those jobs, of course, may well come with very different pay packages or all sorts of things, which might make that notion of sharing quite difficult, really. But I think if it can be achieved, then it's probably the best way forward. And support networks, because I had my mother sadly has passed away now, but she was very around. She only lived very close to us. She was around when the kids were really small. She was an incredible support. I guess, again, I appreciate, saying have support, have your family is for some people that's not possible for a range of different reasons. But I do think when it really comes down to it, those are the things that matter the most. And I suppose changes in the culture of workplaces, and particularly since COVID, and hopefully we're not going to an entirely post flexible working world, although I do wonder if we are actually. But that sort of now sense of flexibility. On the point about flexibility, though, I do wonder what the long-term impact is going to be of, okay, could you just do your job from home, darling, because I really need to go to the office, so could you just be the one who does that? Oh, and by the way, could you just pick up the kids and pick up that thing from the shop and do the washing? And who is that person who's doing that stuff from home? I mean, let's be honest, more often than not in the world we live in, it will be the woman. And what impact will have, on that woman who has already had quite a lot of career and is trying to push forward? What impact will that have on her prospects? I must say, I think in many cases it probably won't be a great probably won't be great, the impact.
The advice around support networks and sharing, which, coming back to a much earlier point that we were discussing around this, is it a silver bullet situation? Well, no, it's not, but also yes, it is, because there's real tangible things that workplaces can do, which ultimately support and benefit family units, families, whatever they may look like, but then also ultimately benefit the workplace is key. But the piece around the impact, it does worry me too a lot. And I often have people saying to me and to the business, well, what about? It's not just about X, it's not just about the female gender, etc., etc. And I always say back that really it's around about 50% of the population, and this is not a zero-sum game, right? It's not a case of she wins, therefore they lose, etc., etc. It's not a zero-sum game. Actually, all of the pieces that you've been talking about throughout this podcast point to the fact that if we support women in the workplace, in particular getting to those senior levels, we're not only going to drive economic growth and prosperity, drive change, real models, role models at the top, and so on and so forth, but we also then drive parity in a number of the other areas, because by product of supporting women in the workplace, we also then gain a better culture, better policies, practices, procedures. And we know that culture takes often quite some time. It takes a pandemic for it to happen, right? So I think some really great advice there. And my final point, and I know we barely talked about your fantastic article, but I will point everyone towards this fantastic article around 50 years of women at the stock exchange, which we can put a link in at the end of today's show for everyone to take a read. But any secrets to your success? I know it's probably finishing here on a hard question, but any secrets to your success? and working through what have been, some pretty crunchy, to use your terminology, times.
Yeah, thank you for that mention. It was really great to do the London Stock Exchange event and to meet some of the ladies who were the first members of the London Stock Exchange 50 years ago. And the thing I was most struck by on that actually was, it would have been easy for those women who I think is probably fair to say came from a kind of a particular social class. They're all, they're really really quite middle class. They could have had a whole different life. They didn't need to kind of be the pioneers there, and really fantastically fascinating actually that they chose to be. That's the thing that I found most intriguing about that. I think for me, journalists are different. Journalists have different skills. Some are fantastic, the most beautiful writers. Some are absolute kind of investigation hounds. They love to find things out. So people have different things that they love about journalism. I think the reason why I've kept working for this long and keep coming in every day and liking it is because I just really enjoy that sort of finding. I love to go out and meet people and speak to them. I love to kind of come away with new ideas and new perspectives. I love to put together one piece of information with another piece of information and hopefully come up with something that's really quite sort of interesting to read. It's not going to shake the world, but it might hopefully be something people are pleased to have a read of or a listen to and move on, and it gives them something in their day. And I love that at the beginning of my career, and I still love that. And I love now with younger reporters trying to give them some pointers about how to think about things or how to go about a particular task. So long may it continue. And that would be my point, I suppose, that you really have got to enjoy doing it. And that can change over time, very much so, most likely will change over time. But just to have that enthusiasm to want to do it well is important.
Well, I think that's such a beautiful way to finish the podcast. The enjoyment, the love, and you can see it so abundantly in the work that you do, the way that you present, the articles that you write, that enjoyment, that sense of purpose to give others the opportunity to learn is absolutely superb. So thank you ever so much for joining me on the show, Katherine. You have been fantastic. Really enjoyed the time. And for those who are listening, you can visit us at dialglobal.org/podcast. You can download the podcast on your favorite podcast app, Apple, Spotify, whichever one you use. You can also check out the podcast notes at the end of today's show if you've missed anything at all. And of course, there is a transcript and a video version if you choose to want to watch the transcript version. But for now, I'll say thank you ever so much. My name is Leila McKenzie-Delis, and you've been listening to the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast by Dial Global, joined by the superb Katherine Griffiths of Bloomberg, and we'll look forward to seeing you again very soon.